the summer of 1892, Ochre Court was built to be seen from everywhere in Newport. Yet one service route tied to the cliff walk vanishes from the record people were meant to read. Introduction, 350-500 palabras, texto corrido. This video examines Ochre Court, a Newport mansion associated with Ogden Goelet and architect Richard Morris Hunt, and the possibility that in 1892 it was quietly altered in a way the public narrative never carried forward. The mini-verdict is simple and uncomfortable. If the omission holds, it does not look accidental. The evidence we start with is not a rumor or a legend, but an architectural anomaly, an access point in the service fabric of the house that later maintenance eyes reportedly flagged because the masonry and alignment read as deliberate, yet it fails to appear in the simplified descriptions and tourist-facing accounts that later defined the property. And the open loop is equally direct. Why would a mansion designed as a symbol of status need a root that was never meant to survive in the normal record? To understand the pressure behind a choice like that, you have to place Newport in its exact moment. The summer colony ran on visibility, arrivals timed, invitations tracked, reputations built in public and protected in private. The ocean-facing paths and boundary lines mattered, especially along landmarks like the Cliff Walk, where the coastline becomes both scenery and corridor. In 1892, America's headlines also carried a different kind of tension. On July 6th, violent conflict erupted at Homestead, Pennsylvania, exposing how quickly labor, money, and force could collide when authority felt threatened. That wider climate matters here, because great houses were not only architecture, they were systems. Staff movement, deliveries, discretion, neighbor relations, and the management of what could be seen or explained if the wrong person asked the wrong question at the wrong time. And records, in that world, were not neutral. Even today, archival materials emphasize how uneven the surviving paper trail can be. Later stage construction, furnishing, and expenses show up clearly, while other phases leave surprisingly little behind, creating blind spots that can look ordinary until one physical detail refuses to fit. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? Because if a passage was real enough to be built and important enough to be treated differently later, then the question is not what ghost used it, but what reputational, logistical, or bureaucratic reason made it safer to erase it. And that takes us to the first measurable starting point, a sealed architectural line, pointing toward the cliff walk, marked for inspection when someone noticed the wall did not behave like the rest of the house. And that is where the record begins. What makes a physical anomaly hard to ignore is not the way it looks, but the way it behaves when you try to place it inside a normal record. A wall can be repaired, a corridor can be repainted, a service door can be reassigned and forgotten. But once a later maintenance hand pauses and marks a section of masonry as out of pattern, the question stops being aesthetic and becomes administrative. Someone at some point had to decide what that space was called, who used it, and whether it would remain visible on paper long after the mortar dried. That is why the next step is never another story. It is paper. In the surviving materials connected to Ochre Court's early years, routine invoices, delivery slips, small notes that only mattered for a day, there is a single folded sheet that does not belong by weight or by intent. It is not ornate. It is not a letter meant to be saved. It reads like the kind of instruction that would be drafted quickly and filed quickly, precisely because it was supposed to disappear into the volume of ordinary business. The date on it is specific, 14th of November, 1893, 11-14, 1893, and the header places it where it should not have any reason to speak about a gate at all, the office of Richard Morris Hunt. It is written on plain office stock, the kind used for internal routing, precise, unsigned, and designed to move work forward without leaving a story behind. The paper is narrow, creased in thirds, the sort of thing that could be tucked between receipts without announcing itself. It was found inside a bundle that, at first glance, appears harmless. Supplier accounts, freight charges, a few small corrections to measurements. It is the kind of folder that archivists and heirs often sort last because it feels repetitive. Yet this sheet is different in one quiet way. It contains an action, written as a directive, tied to a space whose public identity does not survive cleanly in later descriptions. The language is not dramatic, it is practical. It references work that sounds minor until you imagine it executed in stone. The wording is brief, too brief for explanation, too precise for speculation. A line near the center uses the phrase service passage, as if the term requires no clarification between sender and recipient. Another line mentions arch closure, and beside it, in the margin, a single word appears that changes the temperature of the note without turning it into theater. Restricted. It is the kind of notation that exists for one purpose only, to limit who can plausibly say they knew. The recipient is not a society figure. The memo is addressed to a contractor, someone who would understand walls and schedules, not headlines. A vendor name appears in shorthand, the way offices write when they assume everyone knows who B&Co is. The only famous name on the page is the one that anchors authority without argument, Ogden Goelet. Not a signature across the bottom, but a mention in the body, as if the instruction is being carried per Mr. G, and therefore does not require persuasion. That one reference is enough to convert a suggestion into an order. What makes the document strange is not that wealthy houses had service routes. They all did. What makes it strange is that the note describes a renaming, a small administrative switch that only matters if the label itself is a liability. In one sentence, the memo directs that a reference in the working papers be altered, gate changed to storage, and that the service passage be treated thereafter as if it were a simple utility space. The wording is careful, as if the goal is not merely to build something, but to prevent a later reader from asking why it existed in the first place. There is also a second detail that refuses to sit quietly. The memo includes a numbering correction, an instruction to replace one number with another on a plan copy. It is the sort of correction that could be innocent, the kind any office makes when rooms are remeasured. But on this sheet, the correction is paired with the arch closure line. The two actions are bound together, a physical change and a paper change. One alters the building. The other alters the map of the building. Even if the work itself was small, the pairing suggests intention, because it anticipates the future. It anticipates that someone, someday, will look for the old label, the old number, the old point of access, and not find it. And that is where this evidence begins to pull against the facade, because Ochre Court's public identity, its photographs, its descriptions, its later institutional framing, leans on a narrative of spectacle and openness. It is presented as a monument of Newport's Gilded Age confidence, a house made for display, receptions, and legacy. Yet the memorandum, dated after the initial frenzy of construction, speaks in a different register. It is not about chandeliers or salons. It is about restricting movement. It is about changing language. It is about sealing an arch and ensuring that the paper trail will not point a curious finger in the same direction twice. If this were only a question of logistics, it would not need that second step. You would close the arch, note the expense, and move on. You would not need to rename gate to storage. You would not need to correct the numbering in the same breath. Those are not the gestures of convenience. They are the gestures of control, small enough to hide inside routine paperwork, but sharp enough to change what a later reader can reconstruct. The consequence, even at this early stage, is not abstract. The moment a space is reclassified on paper, it changes how labor is assigned, how costs are justified, and how responsibility is distributed. A gate implies access, boundary, and potentially public visibility. Storage implies interior utility, private management, and no reason to ask questions. That shift affects budgets and accountability. If an incident happens near a gate, the liability reads differently than if it happens in storage. If staff movement is questioned, a gate implies an exterior relationship. Storage implies a closed interior loop. The label does quiet work on behalf of whoever needs quiet. The memo does not offer motive, and it does not have to. Its power is in what it confirms. Someone wanted a specific feature of the house to be executed and then linguistically neutralized. The paper does not match the later comfort of the narrative because the later narrative depends on coherence. It depends on the idea that what was built is what was meant. The folded sheet suggests something else, that what was built could be reshaped after the fact, and that the reshaping would be most effective if it looked like routine. And there is one last feature on the page that is easy to miss until you imagine the hand that made it. Near the bottom, after the line about arch closure, a short phrase is struck through, not erased cleanly, but crossed with one firm stroke. The replacement word above it is written smaller, as if the writer wanted the correction to be seen by the person executing the order, but not to dominate the page. The crossed-out word is gate. The word that replaces it is storage. If this was only logistics, why the care in making sure it would not read like one? Because once you see that substitution, the building stops being the only site of evidence. The evidence becomes the process. It becomes the quiet alignment between stone and paperwork, between an arch that can be sealed and a term that can be softened. And it leaves you with a final concrete image before we move. Forward, a folded memorandum dated 14th of November 1893, a single word crossed out, and a new label written in its place, small, deliberate, and still unanswered. By the summer of 1893, Newport was not simply a coastal retreat. It was a stage, and every facade along Bellevue Avenue performed a role. The families who ruled its lawns and terraces understood that status was not owned, it was maintained, and maintenance meant control. In that season's society columns, even the sequence of arriving carriages at the casino mattered. A misplaced visit, a late dinner appearance, or a delivery that entered through the wrong side gate could become the next morning's entertainment in the New York Herald. Newport society was a world that built reputations with the same precision its architects applied to balustrades. The Goelets, new to the front rank but immensely wealthy, were in delicate company. Their Ochre Court, newly completed by Richard Morris Hunt, was the first Newport mansion to rival. The Vanderbilt's marble house in scale and in the ambition of its decoration. To the public, its limestone walls symbolized permanence. Privately, they were a test. Could the Goelets join a hierarchy that treated visibility as currency and discretion as survival? The answer depended less on architecture than on choreography. Where guests entered, which path servants used, what could be seen from the cliff walk, these were not aesthetic choices but lines of social defense. In that same year, 1893, the panic in national markets blurred the fortunes of even the most established names. Newspapers that once printed society news beside market reports began to merge the tones of both, measuring not only wealth but stability. A whisper that a family was overextended or strained could influence banking partners as easily as dinner invitations. In that atmosphere, architectural privacy became an instrument of protection. To show too much was to expose one's solvency. To conceal a modification, even a small one, could be to buy silence. The mechanics of exposure were brutal in their simplicity. Social photographers circulated near Bellevue Avenue gates. A carriage mistakenly sent to a service entrance could appear as a captioned curiosity in illustrated weeklies within days. Servants, dismissed or transferred, carried gossip to rival houses that thrived on comparison. And with Newport's geography, a linear stage where each estate touched the next, the cliff walk was both promenade and vantage point. Every deviation from protocol had witnesses. It is here that the existence of a sealed or redirected passage becomes plausible, even logical. A discrete route along the cliff would have allowed movement without record. Deliveries at dusk, private arrivals, or repairs that did not risk commentary. In this world, the concept of risk meant more than scandal. It meant depreciation. The market value of a house was tethered to its narrative. A property marked by rumor of structural flaw, of unusual visitor, of impropriety, could lose prestige faster than it could be repaired. Builders and owners understood that each gate bore symbolic weight. An entrance used by the wrong person could imply an entire social inversion. The architectural hierarchy mirrored the social one. The grand front steps for peers, the service lane for necessity, and nothing in between. Evidence from period correspondence shows how swiftly a single column could alter a season. A brief mention. In Town Topics or the New York Times Society page, phrases like a certain unease between households or an unannounced departure had measurable impact. Invitations were withheld, engagements postponed, investments delayed. Newport's elite watched these pages as bankers watch exchange rates. Privacy was an asset class, and like any asset, it required management. It was precisely during this tense alignment of architecture and reputation that the 1893 memorandum from the Hunt office gains its weight. A request to rename a gate as storage or to close an arch does not read like censorship until you place it in a world where vocabulary itself could protect fortunes. The alteration was not merely structural, it was semantic. By redefining a threshold, one redefined who could be said to have entered, and therefore, who could be said to belong. To the Goelets, whose New York lineage had long shadowed the older prestige of the Astors and Vanderbilts, discretion was policy. There, hospitality was legendary but measured. Invitations balanced alliances with merchants, financiers, and European titles. The risk of any visible irregularity in 1893, especially one hinting at construction errors, unapproved access, or unrecorded guests, would have been intolerable. Even a rumor could bleed into probate discussions or complicate marriage negotiations, where dowries and settlements depended on unblemished social currency. The consequence of such vigilance was architectural silence. Spaces were adjusted not for convenience, but for reputation management. The quiet ceiling of a route could erase a logistical concern and at the same time remove the possibility of misinterpretation. Newport's facades thus became a language of omissions, every blank wall a statement of what must remain unseen. Yet silence leaves traces. The same records that document floral arrangements and guest lists rarely mention servants' quarters or alternate accesses. But when a later generation of caretakers encountered the uneven masonry along the cliffward side of Ochre Court, they saw an echo of those choices. The wall's texture contradicted the symmetry it was meant to protect. In that contradiction lies the risk the Goelets feared most, that architecture might outlive narrative. Because once the story of perfection is printed, the stone must obey it. And when it doesn't, the question shifts from who visited to what they were avoiding being seen doing. The camera of 1893 could not peer through that wall, but the newspapers could. And in a society that measured worth by exposure carefully controlled, even a closed arch could speak too loudly if left unexplained. It is here that the investigation folds back on itself. On a single wall, a single decision to rename and seal. The year is 1893. Newport is still glittering, still listening. And on the seaside elevation of Ochre Court, the masonry facing the cliff walk remains smoother than it should be. The joint line faint, but visible under the afternoon light. An unacknowledged seam waiting for someone to ask why it was ever necessary. On January 5, 1894, the paperwork stops sounding like construction and starts sounding like governance. Not in the public sense, no announcement, no printed notice, no society page explanation, but in the internal sense that matters more. A small group meets, words are chosen, and from that point forward, the house is described in a way that makes certain questions impossible to ask him, without sounding impolite. The setting is ordinary enough to be overlooked in any later retelling. A temporary office used during the final adjustments, part worksite, part household command post, close to Ochre Court, but not grand. A table large enough for drawings. A ledger open to the day's notes. A few plan sheets with rubbed corners, the paper already softened by hands that have moved it too many times. The kind of room where decisions are made because they have to be made, not because anyone wants drama. The people in the room are also ordinary in the only way that matters. They have authority over what survives. Ogden Goelet is there because the house is his responsibility in every practical sense. Mary Wilson Goelet is there because reputation is never a background detail in Newport. It is a line item that follows a family into every season. An estate administrator or attorney is there because language needs to be defensible, and defensibility is the difference between a private adjustment and a public vulnerability. A representative from the Richard Morris Hunt office is there because drawings are not merely drawings. They are the official description of what exists. And a foreman, the person who can turn a sentence into brickwork, is there because without him, this remains theory. The problem that brings them together does not need to be scandalous to be dangerous. In a place like Newport, danger often arrives as commentary. A neighbor notices unusual movement near the cliffside. A passerby on the cliff walk sees a service figure where no service figure should be. A delivery turns up at an hour that invites curiosity. Or more quietly, the staff's internal routes and the household's public routes begin to overlap in ways that feel inefficient. And inefficiency, in a house built as a statement, can become a story. By this point, the earlier memorandum dated in late 1893 has done its work. The vocabulary is already shifting. Gate softened into storage. AE, service threshold treated as if it were merely utility. But what that memo cannot do is complete the transition from worksite improvisation to official narrative. That is what this meeting is for. The purpose is not simply to manage a door. It is to decide what the door will be allowed to mean in every record that follows. The attorney speaks in the language of quiet prevention. Not hide, not erase, but reduce exposure, avoid misinterpretation, standardize the file. The Hunt representative speaks in the language of documentation. The plan set must match the final condition. The plan copies circulating outside the office must be consistent, and the terms used must not imply access where the owners no longer want access to be implied. The foreman speaks in a different language, load, mortar, time, and cost, and reminds them that sealing an arch is not theory. It will leave a seam unless done carefully. It will change circulation. It will require a decision about keys. And about who holds them. It is Mary's contribution that makes the decision feel inevitable, not emotional. She does not need to describe gossip in detail. She only needs to state what everyone in the room already knows. Newport runs on inference. It does not matter what a route is used for. It matters what it can be made to suggest. A service passage aligned toward the cliff walk is not dangerous because it exists. It is dangerous because it can be talked about by people who do not understand the house's internal logic, and who do not care to. Ogden's role is not to dramatize, but to authorize. He asks, in plain terms, what options exist that do not create further attention. The Hunt representative answers with the professional coldness of a man who has seen how houses become stories. The cleanest option is not simply to seal. It is to align the building and the papers so that no future reader can locate the feature by name, number, or function. If the reference remains on a drawing, then the feature remains arguable. If it remains arguable, it remains discussable. In Newport, what is discussable is never truly private. The action, when it comes, arrives in the form that creates the least noise, a short internal order that can be filed as routine. The attorney drafts the phrasing. It reads like a correction, not a strategy. It authorizes the foreman to seal the relevant opening as part of final service adjustments. It instructs that the term used on all internal papers be renamed to a neutral utility label consistent with household management. It directs the Hunt office to remove the reference from any plan copies that would be considered final, and to treat any sheets that still contain the earlier label or numbering as working drafts. And it authorizes a simple but powerful act: the replacement of the drawing, not the creation of a new truth, but the selection of which version will be allowed to stand as the truth. No one in the room needs to call it a cover story for it to function like one. The consequence is immediate and practical. Once the final set is established, everything else becomes disposable by definition. An older plan sheet becomes superseded. A note that conflicts with the new label becomes misfiled. A line item that hints at a gate becomes a clerical carryover. This is how a clean trail is created without fire or shredding. The file does the erasing on its own, because institutions are built to prefer order over contradiction. And this is where the decision becomes more unsettling than any rumor, because the mechanism is not exotic. It is normal. People with assets protect them. People with reputations manage them. Architects issue revisions. Attorneys standardize language. Foremen execute instructions. Nothing about the process requires criminal intent. It requires only an understanding that, in the long run, the most permanent structure is not stone. It is the version of the stone that survives on paper. The meeting's record, as it survives, does not read like confession. It reads like housekeeping. A dated entry, a brief authorization, a note about revised sheets to be substituted. It may even include a small cost allocation, charged to service modifications rather than anything that would invite questions. That is precisely what makes it valuable as evidence. In a world where scandal would never be written down, the truth is more likely to appear as tone. The careful avoidance of expressive language, the insistence on consistency, the repeated preference for terms that neutralize curiosity. There is also a subtle shift in responsibility. Before this meeting, any irregularity could be blamed on the chaos of building, contractors, shifting plans, necessary improvisation. After January 5, 1894, the irregularity becomes owned. The house is no longer becoming, it is complete. Completion implies intention. Intention implies accountability. This is why the file must be cleaned before the season fully resumes. A completed mansion is a public claim. A contradiction inside its plans becomes an invitation for people who profit from invitations. The Hunt representative, in particular, has a reason to insist on closure. His office trades in legacy as much as the owners do. A lingering discrepancy in the record is not merely inconvenient. It is a future argument about competence, about design, about what was built and why. When a revision is issued, it protects the client and it protects the architect. In a place like Newport, those interests are aligned until they are not, and the only safe approach is to make sure they never have to separate. By the end of the meeting, the work is framed as an adjustment, not an omission. The foreman leaves with instructions and a schedule. The attorney leaves with a wording that can be defended without raising the temperature of a conversation. Mary leaves with the assurance that the house will not provide easy material to people who live off easy material. Ogden leaves with what men of that class always want from a problem, a solution that produces no new story. What remains is the residue of the choice. A final drawing set becomes the official Ochre Court. Everything that conflicts with it becomes noise, draft, error, misclassification, preliminary. That is how a mansion can be altered twice, once in stone, once in record. And the last image the meeting leaves behind is not a dramatic scene. It is paper sliding into a folder, a plan sheet on the table with one label faintly rubbed, another written over it in smaller hand, a marginal note initialed by someone who will never be named in public history, a clean set prepared to outlive everyone present. Because from that day forward, the question is no longer whether the root existed. The question is which version of Ochre Court was authorized to survive, and what exactly had to be reclassified as draft to make the official version possible. On March 2, 1894, 1894, the decision becomes visible in the only places that matter, in the service fabric of Ochre Court's lower levels, and in the paperwork that would later teach everyone what the house was supposed to be. Until that day, the route exists in a tense half-life, hinted at by internal language, contradicted by later storytelling, physically suggested by masonry that does not fully match its surroundings. After that day, it begins to disappear in a way that does not require drama, only procedure. The work is carried out the way expensive houses are always adjusted, quietly, early, and with a contractor who understands that speed is part of discretion. A crew is assigned to the basement and service wing, spaces that never appear in society photographs, spaces that rarely interest guests unless something goes wrong. This is where roots live. This is where a small architectural truth can be corrected without anyone upstairs noticing. The contractor's instruction is practical, not theatrical. It does not say erase, it says finish, close, normalize, the vocabulary of a project that must be brought into compliance with a new final condition. The foreman identifies the threshold that had functioned as the problematic access, whether it is an arched opening or a narrower service door, aligned in the direction that made it socially sensitive. The first step is not brick, it is measurement. The opening is squared, the surrounding stone examined for how it carries weight, and the adjacent wall section mapped for how a patch might be made to read as original. Then the physical alteration happens in stages, each one designed to make the next one less noticeable. The opening is framed internally, its edges cleaned, and the first course of masonry is laid with intent to merge, not to announce itself. Mortar is chosen to match what already exists, and where it cannot match perfectly, the crew uses the oldest trick in building. Maintenance. They make the mismatch look like routine repair. They work the seam into a joint line that a casual eye would accept. They shift the visual break toward a corner where shadows do the hiding. The arch, if it is an arch, does not become a pile of rubble. It becomes a shape that no longer functions as an opening. A threshold becomes a wall. But the most effective part of the alteration is that it does not end as a wall. It ends as something that looks purposeful. On the service side, the new section is often finished into utility. A shallow cabinet is installed. Shelving goes in. A latch appears on a plain door that looks like it has always been there. If there is a corridor beyond, the corridor is turned into storage, not by adding mystery, but by adding ordinary clutter. A broom closet is the most convincing disguise in any large house because it invites no questions. An arched root becomes a place for supplies, buckets, spare linens, maintenance tins. Even the smell of the space changes, not because anyone is staging it, but because utility areas develop their own identity when they stop being passages. Paint is applied in the same restrained way, not new color that calls attention, but a coat meant to flatten differences. The contractor's crew makes sure the finish matches the broader service palette. In basements, perfection is not expected, which means imperfection is safe. A patch can live there for decades because no one looks closely unless they already suspect something. This is the physical side of the alteration, the conversion of an access into an object, the shift from root to room. The house is not being rebuilt. It is being redirected. Staff movement is adjusted so the sealed threshold is no longer needed. Locks are reassigned. Keys are consolidated. A small change in the basement can reorganize an entire pattern of circulation above without any guest ever noticing, but the alteration does not truly succeed until the paper changes match the stone. That same day, or immediately after, the office process begins. A representative from the Richard Morris Hunt office issues what looks like routine documentation, a revised set of plan sheets and internal descriptions for circulation. Not public brochures, not tourist narratives, workmanlike copies intended for estate management, repairs, and future reference. In a house this complex, revised sets are normal. That normality is the hiding place. The new plan set does not announce a secret. It announces order. The numbering is cleaned up. A label that once implied access, something that could be read as gate or a named passage, does not appear in the revised legend. Instead, neutral administrative terms take its place. Storage, maintenance, service, words that describe function without inviting further inference. If a corridor line remains, it is shortened. If an opening symbol existed, it is removed or replaced by a wall line that reads continuous. In technical language, the plan is standardized. In narrative language, it becomes teachable. The process is precise because precision prevents argument. An old sheet might still exist in a contractor's roll or in a folder that survived by accident, but it is now officially superseded. The revision note, brief, unemotional, turns the older drawing into a mistake by definition. The documents that conflict with the new version are not destroyed in a dramatic act. They are demoted. They become drafts. They become working material. They become the kind of paper people stop defending when questions are asked. A subtle administrative action follows that is more powerful than the masonry: distribution control. The revised plan set is the one circulated internally. The estate administrator uses it. The maintenance staff learns the house through it. Any future contractor asked to do work in the service wing is given the final drawings, not the earlier ones. Over time, the revised plan becomes the only Ochre Court that matters because it becomes the only Ochre Court that can be cited without sounding unreliable. That is the mechanism that makes later doubt inevitable. Years pass. Staff changes. Administrators retire. The house's story becomes polished. When decades later someone encounters a strange seam or a wall section that feels too deliberate, they reach for the official plan because that is what responsible people do. And the plan answers with calm authority. There is no passage there. There is no gate there. There is a storage space, a continuous wall, a normal service arrangement. The consequence is not merely that something is hidden. The consequence is that the act of noticing becomes socially and institutionally awkward. The person who points to the seam is not discovering anything in the official record. They are contradicting it. And contradiction, in formal property management, is treated as error until proven otherwise. The result is a quiet inversion. The physical building becomes the unreliable witness, and the paper becomes the truth. This is how a detail can be made to leave the real world without needing to be fully erased. It is not that the passage never existed. It is that it can no longer be demonstrated with the tools people are trained to trust. The proof becomes trapped between architecture and bureaucracy, too physical to be dismissed entirely, too undocumented to be affirmed without embarrassment. If you could erase a compromising detail from your house before the first major party, would you erase it? What makes the alteration unsettling is that it is accomplished by ordinary expertise. Contractors do this kind of normalization constantly, turning unnecessary doors into walls, converting awkward niches into closets, simplifying circulation when a house transitions from construction to operation. Architects revise drawings to match final conditions all the time. Estate administrators prefer clean records because clean records reduce friction. None of these actions require malice. They require only a reason to prefer quiet. And in Newport in 1894, quiet was not a mood, it was strategy. The contractor's invoice for the day, if it survives, would not confess anything. It would describe labor and material. It might refer to closure, finish work, service modifications. The Hunt Office revision note would be the same. Functional language, minimal explanation, routine tone. Together they form the most convincing kind of evidence because they do not sound like evidence at all. They sound like management. By the end of March 2, the building behaves differently. A route that once allowed movement becomes a dead end by design. A threshold that once had meaning becomes a utility feature. The house becomes more coherent, not less, at least on paper. And coherence is what institutions protect because coherence stabilizes reputation. What remains, however, is not a ghost story. It is a residue of workmanship. A faint line where mortar meets older stone. A cabinet that sits slightly proud of the wall. A plan legend that uses a neutral term where a more specific one might once have existed. These are small things, but small things are often what survive when larger explanations are denied space. The last image of this alteration is almost disappointingly simple. A revised plan sheet on plain paper, the basement service level rendered in clean lines, with one area labeled storage in a neutral hand, while in the actual service wing below the grand rooms, a wall section carries a seam that refuses to align perfectly with the rest of the masonry. And that seam, half architectural, half administrative, is the tension we carry into what comes next. Because once the physical change is completed and the paperwork is standardized. The real question is no longer how the passage was closed. It is what exactly had to be reclassified, corrected, or quietly set aside to make the official Ochre Court possible. By September 29, 1897, the silence surrounding Ochre Court had become more valuable than any of its imported marble. Ogden Goelet was dead, his estate entering probate, and the Newport season that year carried a sharper chill. With his passing, the paper trail of one of America's wealthiest men had to be cleaned, cataloged, and made legible, not for the sake of truth, but for continuity. In such transitions, order replaces curiosity. The trustees, responsible for the Goelet estate, worked in rooms full of paper, not sentiment. Their first task was not to evaluate architecture or rumor, but to separate categories: construction from ownership, draft from record, personal correspondence from financial continuity. The difference might sound clerical, but it defined what would survive in public memory. Documents from the 1892-1894 period, work orders, revisions, instructions, were reclassified as materials of completion, anything not matching. The clean narrative of an inherited stable property was downgraded to temporary. And temporary, in estate language, means disposable. The widow, Mary Wilson Goelet, now carried both fortune and expectation. Newport watched her with the same precision it had once reserved for her ballroom gowns. Her husband's passing was not a scandal, but it was a test. Would the family maintain its position in the social order? In such a world, even a whisper about irregularities in the mansion, alternate routes, private accesses, undocumented features, could transform architecture into metaphor. To speak of a hidden passage at Ochre Court after 1897 would have sounded indecorous, so it stopped being spoken of. The administrators of the estate acted with efficiency that borders on choreography. Their action was direct. The physical archives were consolidated, inventories retyped, ledgers cross-checked, and all non-essential technical documents were removed from the main estate file. Plans were lacquered with legitimacy through process, stamped, sealed, indexed, and anything conflicting with the official versions was simply tagged work copy. The category itself did the silencing. Work copies did not require explanation in inheritance meetings. They did not require preservation. The consequence was institutional, not emotional. By the time the trustees submitted their summary inventories, Ochre Court existed only in its official configuration: one mansion, one version, one unbroken. Reputation. The line that once hinted at a sealed passage was buried under clerical correctness. No one needed to lie. The truth was drowned under process. Beneficiaries emerged naturally. Mary Wilson Goelet and her children, Mary and Robert Wilson Goelet, inherited an estate that could circulate among peers without friction. The real estate portfolio in Newport and New York appeared consistent, the tax assessments uncontested, the property descriptions pristine. In a class where the appearance of normality equaled financial stability, the absence of irregularities was capital. What had begun as an architectural adjustment now matured into a legal advantage. Silence also protected reputation. The Goelet name, tied to banking, land, and marriage alliances, depended on predictability. Newport's elite valued predictable wealth more than spectacular wealth. To preserve that predictability, any unresolved trace from construction, especially something implying unrecorded access or private design motives, had to vanish from formal archives. The mansion thus entered estate history as complete, immune to speculation, its floor plans uncontested by any parallel drafts. This kind of disappearance was not destruction but absorption. The documentation that contradicted the official version wasn't burned. It was reclassified into obscurity. Estate lawyers often referred to it as background material. Background material was filed deep in boxes labeled for administrative retention, inaccessible without specific request. A century later, that bureaucratic quietness is what confuses researchers most. There is no act of concealment to point to, only a sequence of tidy administrative acts that erase their own necessity. If anyone benefited directly, it was Mary Wilson Goelet, who could now navigate both society and inheritance without friction. She inherited not only the property, but the narrative control that kept Ochre Court from being a conversation topic. In a period when widows were often subjected to public scrutiny, her silence became strategy. By allowing administrators to normalize the estate records, she gained what mattered most in Newport: undisturbed legitimacy. The arrangement also safeguarded the next generation. Robert Wilson Goelet, still young, would one day inherit without the burden of explaining the past. Inheritance documents would show a clean title, a clear valuation, and no irregularities that might slow transfer or complicate taxation. The act of silencing one architectural curiosity thus preserved decades of unchallenged ownership. The mansion's integrity, both legal and symbolic, was purchased with administrative invisibility. There was an economic logic behind it, too. In 1897, estate taxes and legal valuations depended heavily on clarity of records. The fewer anomalies, the smoother the process. A clean Ochre Court ensured that its appraised value remained high and its insurance straightforward. Any suggestion of unfinished or undocumented areas could trigger reassessment, which meant risk of delay, risk of inquiry, risk of rumor. When money, law, and reputation converged, silence became policy. In retrospect, the Goelets' gain was not immoral, it was methodical. They benefited from the natural tendency of institutions to prefer legibility over truth. Archivists filed clean copies because they looked professional. Lawyers referenced standard plans because they simplified proceedings. Bankers accepted valuations without irregularities because it kept transactions predictable. The system rewarded the absence of friction, not the presence of accuracy. By the end of 1897, the alteration completed 3 years earlier had matured into an inheritance fact. The documents confirmed one consistent reality: the estate's public ledger listed Ochre Court without any mention of additional works or non-conforming elements. The plan copies held by the trustees matched those approved by the Hunt office. The photographs circulating in society, magazines showed only what was meant to be seen. A deviation, once real, had been successfully converted into an administrative impossibility. If there was a secret, it was bureaucratic, not moral. Everyone involved gained by not revisiting the past. Mary kept social control. The trustees secured procedural order. The heirs inherited an asset free from ambiguity. Even the architect's reputation benefited. Hunt's office could cite Ochre Court as another triumph of precision and grandeur, with no hint of internal correction. It is here that the investigation's tone shifts. The question is no longer who built or who sealed, but who profited from forgetting. The answer is unsettlingly simple: everyone who had a stake in stability. The omission became self-perpetuating because it served all parties. And that is how, in the autumn of 1897, the silence surrounding Ochre Court ceased being defensive and became structural. It no longer protected a single incident or choice. It protected the system that required such choices never to be questioned. The last trace of that transformation survives not in scandal, but in paperwork. An inventory summary signed by a trustee, dated September 29, 1897, where one line item reads only, Ochre Court, complete. The word complete is double underlined, no annotations, no appended drawings, no references to earlier materials, and in that small bureaucratic flourish, the underline, resides the quiet victory of those who gained most when nobody asked what complete really meant. By 1895, Ochre Court is no longer a project, it is operating. The house is being used hard. Staff patterns stabilized, seasonal routines established, the public-facing rhythm of arrivals and departures refined into something that looks effortless. And that is exactly when the disappearance becomes measurable. Because once a mansion enters full social use, it begins to generate the kinds of records that are supposed to make it legible, seasonal logs, maintenance notes, inventories, photograph albums, key lists, small administrative files that, taken together, create a map of daily reality. In well-run estates, that map thickens quickly. You see it in the way an office marks what was purchased and where it was stored, which doors require which keys, which gates are serviced and which are decorative, which passages are meant for staff and which are meant for guests. That is why the anomaly at Ochre Court becomes most interesting, not only where the wall seam sits, but where the paperwork goes quiet at precisely the point when it should become more detailed. The first gap appears in the visual record. A house like this produces photographs in abundance. Not only formal exteriors, but casual images of terraces, walks, garden edges, and service details that appear unintentionally at the margins. Background railings, a side stair, a segment of stonework behind a figure. In the albums associated with a new mansion's early seasons, sequences tend to follow a predictable logic: approach, facade, grounds, interior highlights, and then the supporting world that makes the display possible. But in 1895, that sequence shows a subtle rupture. There are pages that bear the ghost of having been removed, paper fibers along the binding, a change in the thickness of a section, the sense that a run of images once existed and now does not. Nothing dramatic is announced. The album simply skips. The cliffward edge is shown in wide, flattering angles, yet the service side detail that would normally appear, because photographers inevitably drift, does not. The absence does not prove anything by itself. It only tells you where the record stops cooperating. The second gap is administrative, and it is harder to explain away as taste. Estate offices keep inventories not as literature but as control. In the years after completion, the inventory becomes more granular. Hardware, locks, spare keys, hinges, gate, latches, replacement ironwork, even the kind of things no guest would ever notice. This is exactly where the disappearance begins to leave teeth marks, because the records that should contain an unromantic continuity start to show an odd smoothness. Terms become broader, detail collapses into categories. Where you might expect a specific reference, gate key, service passage latch, arch hardware, anything that distinguishes one threshold from another, you find language that has been generalized. A door becomes service. A location becomes storage. A piece of hardware becomes maintenance. The effect is not that the house becomes simpler. The effect is that the files become less capable of pointing to any one sensitive point. And then there is the disappearance that tends to happen only when someone has learned what questions to avoid. The missing link in a logical sequence. A season log may show a reference to keys returned without listing what keys. A maintenance note may indicate closure finished without specifying what was closed. An inventory page may jump in numbering or show an inserted sheet that keeps the count consistent while removing a detail that would have forced specificity. These are small discontinuities, but they matter because they do not occur randomly. They cluster around the same conceptual area: thresholds, access, classification. The action that produces this kind of gap is rarely cinematic. It is procedural. In 1895, after the house's routines have solidified, someone in the estate office can simply decide that a certain subset of materials belongs in a different category. A plan sheet that still carries older labeling becomes draft, no retention. A page of key identifiers becomes temporary working list. A photograph that includes an angle deemed undesirable becomes not for circulation. A clerk tasked with making the estate file coherent can remove the items that introduce contradiction without ever writing the reason down. The record becomes cleaner because cleaner is the default goal of estate management. Sometimes the action is literal removal, pages lifted from an album, a sheet pulled from a folder. But more often, the action is the gentler form of disappearance, reclassification into irrelevance. Once a document is labeled as a work copy, it stops being protected. Once a photo is deemed duplicate, it stops being preserved. Once a key list is treated as operational, it can be replaced, rewritten, and then discarded because operational papers are expected to change. And when operational papers change, history loses its grip. The consequence is immediate for anyone trying to reconstruct what happened later, because the investigation is forced off the direct path. If the official plan set says storage, and the photograph albums avoid the relevant angles, and the inventories collapse hardware into broad categories, you cannot prove the earlier configuration by pointing to a single authoritative record. Instead, you are pushed into indirect traces, the kinds of things people preserve without realizing they are evidence. Costs that do not match the stated work, receipts for ironwork that imply a gate mechanism even when no gate is officially acknowledged, measurements that suggest a corridor footprint where the plan insists on a solid wall, a vendor bill for lock sets that exceeds what the recorded doors would require. The disappearance doesn't kill the investigation. It redirects it into accounting and mechanics. This is where the narrative control becomes visible as a practice rather than a conspiracy. No scandal needs to be asserted. No improper visitor needs to be invented. The point is narrower and more defensible. Once a house becomes a symbol, its caretakers have an incentive to make the story consistent before outsiders begin to ask why it isn't. In 1895, the most valuable form of control is not to add a new story, but to remove the fragments that could force competing ones. It also changes the tone of institutional memory. People working at the house learn to treat certain questions as unproductive. A staff member who notices a patch in the service wall is told it's old work. A newer clerk who sees mismatched terminology is told the older paper was pre-final. Over time, that vocabulary becomes routine. The house trains its own keepers to prefer the official record over the physical oddities that contradict it. That is normalization in its earliest form. But here, 1895, we can still see the transition happening because the gaps are fresh enough to feel like edits rather than tradition. The strongest version of the disappearance is therefore not a burned file. It is a coherent archive built by subtraction. When the record reads smoothly, it becomes hard to argue with, because smoothness is mistaken for accuracy. And when accuracy is assumed, anyone who points to a seam in the masonry becomes the problem. Imaginative, obsessive, disrespectful to a legacy that appears settled. That is why the disappearance does not prove guilt. It proves intent to curate. It proves that someone valued coherence enough to remove the pieces that would have made coherence difficult. It proves that narrative was treated as an asset of the property, not merely a byproduct of it. And the final image we're left with is a small physical fact embedded in paperwork. A bound estate folder from the mid-1890s, its contents neatly indexed, with one index number present, but the corresponding page absent, leaving only the faint outline of where a line item used to sit, the kind of missing piece that does not scream, but quietly forces the next question. Because once you see an absence that aligns too well with what the official story needs, you are no longer chasing a rumor. You are chasing the shape of what was removed, one page, one label, one key identifier, and asking what exactly had to disappear for Ochre Court to remain coherent. By July 17, 1896, 1896, the most useful witnesses are no longer photographs or polished descriptions. They are numbers, because numbers, unlike reputations, have to balance. A society narrative can be curated indefinitely. A plan set can be revised until it reads clean. But an estate that pays bills must account for what was paid for, and that accounting leaves a second trail that is harder to smooth without creating new problems. This is where the house begins to betray what the paper tries to calm. The inconsistency does not arrive as a dramatic discovery. It arrives as an entry that looks routine until you try to match it to what is officially supposed to exist. In the property administration's retained records, whether a fiscal ledger, a vendor invoice register, or a consolidated estate expense book, there is a dated line for ironwork and hardware that is too specific to be decorative and too expensive to be shrugged off as general maintenance. The vendor is not a household name in the narrative, but it is the kind of supplier that appears in any serious property operation: an ironworks firm, a gate and hinge provider, someone who sells heavy-duty fittings meant for thresholds, not cupboards. The content is what matters. The entry references a set of items that have a functional profile: heavy hinges, latch hardware, lock mechanisms, possibly even a gate fitting or reinforced bracketry, components designed to control passage. It also includes either a measurement or a quantity that implies scale. Not a single replacement lock. Not a few nails. Enough hardware to suggest an assembly, an access point, a closure. Something that would have required both metal and alignment. On its own, that would be unremarkable. Big houses consume hardware the way they consume coal. The problem begins when you take the same date range and compare it against the final description of Ochre Court's service and basement zones, the cleaned plan set, the standardized labels, the official internal terminology that reduces sensitive thresholds into neutral categories like storage or maintenance. In those documents, there is no destination that convincingly absorbs what was purchased. There is no listed gate that needs new gate grade fittings. There is no documented service entrance that requires the quantity implied by the entry. There is no room identified in a way that makes the hardware inevitable. That is the inconsistency. Paid for function without declared function. The action at this stage is not a guess. It is a method. The estate administration does what any careful accountant or any careful investigator would do. It cross-references two basic claims: what the estate spent money on and what the estate said it had. On one side, you have the ledger line dated 079/17/1896, tied to an iron supplier or gate hardware vendor, with quantities and cost that imply more than cosmetic upkeep. On the other side, you have a coherent official record in which the corresponding feature is either renamed into harmlessness or absent altogether. When those two trails do not meet, the gap becomes evidence, because it forces a question that is not interpretive. Why pay for something you refuse to name? The most plausible answers are also the least exciting, and that is why they are so powerful. Hardware like that could be installed for security after an incident. It could be added to control staff movement. It could be used to reinforce a closure. That had been normalized, but still required a functional barrier behind its new face. It could be part of making sure a sealed threshold stayed sealed. Any of these would be administratively defensible. None require scandal, but every one implies the same underlying fact. There was an element of access control significant enough to justify cost, even if the official language preferred not to describe it. And that preference has consequences, because once the record refuses to say where the hardware went, future readers are forced into a false choice. Either the estate wasted money irrationally, which is unlikely in the hands of professional administrators, or the feature existed and was simply not permitted to remain legible. This is the moment where the investigation becomes less about atmosphere and more about documentation. It is difficult to argue with a payment that has no corresponding destination, because the payment exists precisely to prevent ambiguity inside the estate's own operation. The estate's administrative culture also explains why this kind of inconsistency can survive. Ledger lines are preserved because they are needed for audits, tax considerations, and internal accountability. Plan legends and descriptive narratives are preserved because they are used to teach the house to new caretakers. But the link between them, what we might call the explanatory bridge, is often the first thing to be treated as disposable. A short note identifying the precise location of installed hardware might be filed as temporary. A work order that clarifies which threshold received reinforced fittings might be labeled operational, and operational papers, as we've seen, are the easiest to reclassify into silence. So the inconsistency becomes a kind of surviving proof, not because it tells us everything, but because it tells us one thing with stubborn clarity. The estate paid for functionality that the official story cannot comfortably place. That is the most documentary conclusion this part of the case can offer without overreaching. It does not claim motive. It does not assign scandal. It does not pretend to know who used the route or why. It only states what the record structure implies. If money was spent on controlling or reinforcing a threshold, then some threshold had to exist in practice, regardless of how the plans were later cleaned. And this is where you have to decide what kind of evidence you trust. Do you trust the elegant coherence of a curated description written to preserve the dignity of a famous property? Or do you trust the blunt honesty of a ledger entry that no one wrote for the public and no one expected to be read like a confession? You trust what can't perform, because a receipt does not care how the house looks from Bellevue Avenue. A cost line does not care what the cliff walk sees. A vendor invoice does not care about society. It cares about delivery, quantity, and payment. And when those numbers refuse to match the official picture, the house is speaking through the only language that survives editing. You trust the paper nobody wanted you to read. The final image in this section is therefore not a wall seam or a missing photograph. It is a single dated ledger line, 07 to 17, 1896, with an ironwork supplier's name, a cost that implies more than minor repair, and a column where the destination should be clear but isn't. A functional purchase, a silent file, a gap that holds its shape. And that gap is exactly what we carry forward, because once the numbers don't balance, the next question becomes less romantic and more dangerous. Who had the authority to keep the books honest while keeping the story clean? In 1896, Newport's most expensive commodity was not land or marble or even the prestige of a famous architect. It was interpretability. A house on Bellevue Avenue had to be read in a single, flattering way by the people who mattered. Neighbors, rivals, society editors, clubmen, bankers, and the quiet observers who carried impressions from one drawing room to another. That is why an unofficial route was not merely a design oddity. In that season, it was a reputational hazard with a predictable chain reaction. By then, Ochre Court was already a statement. It was built to compete in a landscape where comparison was constant and unforgiving. Rival houses did not need to be openly attacked. They only needed to be framed. If a detail could be interpreted as impropriety, insecurity, or incompetence, the framing would do the damage while everyone maintained manners. A discreet access aligned toward the cliff walk, something that could be described as a service passage in an internal memo, then renamed and reduced on official plans, was exactly the kind of detail that could be weaponized without anyone ever needing to accuse anyone of anything directly. Because Newport scandal rarely traveled as a headline first, it traveled as a question. Why was that gate used at night? Why were deliveries routed along the cliffside? Why would a house that claimed perfect order need a reinforced threshold that didn't appear on the official description? Why would the estate pay for gate-grade ironwork in a season when nothing in the public-facing plan required it? Once those questions existed, the story did not have to be true to be dangerous. It only had to be plausible enough to repeat. In 1896, plausibility could be manufactured by small observations. One carriage seen turning where it shouldn't, one servant moving along a path meant for promenades, one latch heard closing in a place that was supposedly just storage. A rival household didn't need evidence. They needed a detail that could be pointed at and a circle willing to talk about it over breakfast. The possible interpretations were obvious, and that was the problem. A non-official route could be read as discreet meetings. It could be read as a private workaround for neighbor disputes along property edges. It could be read as an attempt to control access to the cliff walk in a town where boundaries between public and private were constantly contested by privilege. Or it could be read as something more mundane but equally corrosive, that the house's service operations contradicted the elegant image it projected, an admission that the machine behind the facade was messier than the facade suggested. Any of those readings would have injured the same thing: authority. Ochre Court's authority rested on coherence. Coherence meant the house was not only expensive, but controlled. Controlled meant the family was not only wealthy, but capable of holding a social position without creating uncertainty around it. Uncertainty is what society circles punish first, because uncertainty forces people to choose sides before they want to. So if the route had become public conversation in 1896, who would have fallen first? Not necessarily the Goelets in a dramatic way. Newport rarely produced public collapses on cue. The first fall is subtler: access. Invitations tighten, clubs become cooler, weekend guest lists shift towards safer combinations. A name still appears in the paper, but the language changes. Less warmth, more formality. Allies hesitate to be photographed in the wrong place at the wrong time. A family becomes difficult, not because anyone says so openly, but because the social machinery begins to root around them the way an estate roots around a sensitive entrance. The risk also extends beyond society into finance and governance. Wealth in that era was often structured through trusts, property holdings, and relationships with advisors who prized predictability. A rumor that suggested boundary disputes, unrecorded access, or questionable internal management could invite scrutiny, insurance questions, valuation questions, quiet inquiries by bankers or attorneys who dislike ambiguous assets. If an unofficial route implied a problem with the properties, control, physical control, neighbor control, or narrative control, then the house itself became a variable. Variables are what trustees and investors hate because they force documentation, and documentation in this case was exactly what the estate had been trained to avoid producing. That is why the elite response to risk in 1896 would not be spectacle, it would be containment. Letters written on plain stationery, calls made through intermediaries, attorneys framing the issue as routine, maintenance or security improvements, household administrators tightening staff instructions, a quiet insistence that certain questions are in poor taste, the removal of anything that could be misread, labels, plan references, keys listed too specifically. Not a public denial, but a private tightening of the record until the rumor loses the oxygen of detail. The action is therefore predictable and concrete. Narrative control becomes policy. The estate consolidates what it circulates. It limits which plan sets leave the office. It standardizes terminology so that a clerk can answer questions without improvisation. It treats earlier drafts as non-binding and, by doing so, deprives rivals of a technical hook they could cite. If a visitor hints at the Clifford service side, the answer becomes simple: storage. If someone asks about a gate, the answer becomes maintenance. The goal is not to persuade the curious. The goal is to deny them material that sounds authoritative when, repeated. Because the true danger of 1896 is not that someone discovers the route. The danger is that someone uses it to rewrite what Ochre Court represents. In a town built on prestige competition, a single misinterpreted detail can be turned into a theme. The house that needs hiding places. The house that can't control its boundaries. The house that pays for gates it pretends don't exist. And once a theme is established, rivals don't even need to spread it. Society spreads it as entertainment. Because entertainment is how power polices itself while pretending it doesn't. The consequence becomes the most rational outcome in that world. Suppress the detail before it becomes a category. Not because there is a crime to cover, but because there is a narrative to protect. A house that was meant to announce dominance cannot afford a side story that turns it into an object of speculation. Even a harmless explanation, service logistics, security, construction correction, would still concede that something required explanation. And in Newport, concession is the first step toward social leverage in someone else's hands. So the record is cleaned further, the terminology becomes flatter, the archive becomes quieter. The most dangerous thing about the route is not what it was used for, but how easily it could be used against the people who owned it. And the final image of this risk is not a headline, because headlines are rarely the first weapon. The final image is a private. 1. A short letter drafted for an attorney's file dated in the 1896 season, advising that all references to the former designation be discontinued in circulated materials, and that staff be instructed to treat the area as routine storage. No accusations, no justification, just a clear acknowledgement of the only thing that mattered. The story had to remain clean, because if it didn't, someone else would tell it for them. And once you understand that, the next question is unavoidable. If the rational move was always to suppress. How did that suppression become ordinary enough to last? In 1947, something happens to Ochre Court that is more durable than any single wall repair. The building changes hands, and with it, the building changes language. What had once been a private estate problem, handled by owners, architects, attorneys, and a small circle of staff, becomes an institutional property problem, handled by administrators, maintenance teams, and policies that are designed to outlive the people who write them. That is the moment when silence stops being a choice and becomes a system. The transfer itself is outwardly uncomplicated. Robert Wilson Goelet is no longer protecting a summer house narrative for Newport society. He is stepping into the role of a donor or seller whose primary interest is an orderly transition. On the other side, the Sisters of Mercy and the emerging institution that will be known as Salve Regina College inherit not only a mansion, but the responsibilities that come with a complex historic structure: safety, accessibility, budgets, staffing, and the constant pressure to make old spaces serve new functions. There is no reason, in that moment, for anyone to reopen a question that the estate's own files have already learned to keep quiet. There is every reason to simplify. That is how normalization begins, not with a decision to conceal, but with a decision to operate. In an institutional handover, the first priority is never romance or history. It is a usable map. Someone compiles the basic documentation that allows the property to be managed: room lists, key schedules, restricted areas, mechanical access points, service routes, and do not enter notes that are often written with a tired kind of practicality. The older the building, the more those notes multiply, because old buildings contain conditions that modern managers do not want to explain repeatedly. They want shorthand. They want terms that stop conversation. So, the language that once hinted at an anomaly becomes even more neutral. Words like gate or anything that implies a threshold with social meaning are replaced by terms that feel purely operational: restricted, maintenance, preservation, service access, storage. Those words do not tell you what a place used to be. They only tell you what you are allowed to do with it now. And crucially, they tell you that you are not supposed to ask why. The action that matters in 1947 is therefore administrative and physical at the same time. The property is rekeyed, the access hierarchy is redefined, and a new routine is installed. A door that had once been sealed, renamed, and removed from official story becomes a door that is simply kept locked. A space that once carried ambiguity becomes a space that carries policy. The institutional staff does what competent staff always do when they inherit a building with odd corners and partial documentation. They establish defaults. Locked by default is the strongest default in any bureaucracy. From there, the silence stabilizes through paperwork that does not look like secrecy. Maintenance logs begin referencing the area without narrating it. Work orders become formulaic. A request might read, basement, service storage, check latch, or lower level, restricted access, inspect dampness, and no one writing the request needs to know what the space once was called. The work order system trains its users to speak in codes that are safe, repeatable, and boring. Boredom, in this context, is protection. Keys become the next mechanism of normalization because keys are how institutions turn history into routine. A key that once circulated through a small private staff now enters a managed system: a key cabinet, a sign-out sheet, a facilities office drawer, a ring tagged with an intentionally bland label. The label is never passage, it is never gate. It is something like service, maint, storage, restricted. The tag becomes the new truth. Anyone who inherits the job inherits the tag and the instruction that goes with it. Keep it controlled. Over time, the human relationship to the odd feature changes. In the private era, a sealed route is a conscious choice. In the institutional era, it is a condition, and conditions are not investigated unless they cause costs. That is where bureaucratic friction becomes more effective than conspiracy. An institution has limited incentives to reopen old architectural questions. Reopening creates liability. It creates expense. It creates safety obligations. It creates documentation requirements. It can trigger preservation debates, structural assessments, insurance questions, even public curiosity if the institution is visible. In contrast, leaving a door locked requires almost nothing. It requires only that a few people know the routine and that those people train the next group the same way. This is how the silence becomes self-perpetuating. A new maintenance supervisor arrives and is told, "That section stays locked. Only open it if necessary." A new administrator asks why a space is listed as restricted and is told, "Old building, preservation." The answer is not false. It is simply incomplete in a way that keeps the system smooth. And in institutions, smoothness is a survival instinct. The normalization also changes the archive. Private estate papers can be contradictory and personal. Institutional archives tend to become standardized. The college keeps what it needs for operations: property descriptions, insurance documentation, basic plans, major renovation records. Anything that does not serve current use is more likely to be boxed, stored, or never fully integrated into a central file. Even if an older work copy plan sheet survives somewhere in a legacy folder, it is not the plan sheet that gets photocopied for daily use. The daily use version becomes the only version most staff ever see. In other words, the institution does not have to erase anything actively. It only has to choose which documents become alive through repeated reference. The living record is what shapes reality. There is also a subtle cultural shift that reinforces the process. The private Newport world was built on reputation management, on controlling what outsiders could interpret. The institutional world is built on risk management, on controlling what can go wrong. Those two impulses produce the same result for different reasons. If an area is ambiguous, risk management prefers to reduce access. If an area is inconvenient, operations prefers to simplify language. If an area is historically sensitive, preservation prefers to limit interference. All three point to the same policy outcome: keep it locked, name it neutrally, document it minimally, and move on. This is how a feature that once required deliberate narrative control can survive for decades without anyone feeling they are participating in a secret. They are participating in procedure. Procedure is what people defend, because procedure is what keeps them employed, and procedure becomes strongest when it is inherited. As Salve Regina grows, as the property's use becomes more complex, the maintenance staff changes. Generations of workers cycle through. Each generation receives the same instructions, often without context, because context is not required to do the job. Door stays secured. Keys are controlled. Restricted access. Over time, those phrases become less like rules and more like background noise, as ordinary as the instruction to shut off water before repairing a line. That is the most efficient form of erasure, the one that feels like basic competence. The consequence, by mid-century and after, is that the anomaly becomes functionally invisible, not because it is gone, but because the institution has built a system that discourages the kinds of curiosity that would make it legible again. Staff members who might notice a seam in the masonry are trained to interpret seams as age, not as narrative. Administrators who might notice an odd label are trained to interpret odd labels as legacy, not as evidence. Researchers who might request access are met with the same friction every institution deploys by default: permissions, schedules, safety rules, liability concerns, staffing limitations. None of it is sinister. All of it is effective. The most unsettling part is that the original motive no longer matters. By 1947, even if the original closure had been purely defensive and practical, the new system ensures that nobody needs to revisit it. The silence becomes independent of its origin. It becomes an institutional habit, and habits are harder to break than secrets. If you want to see normalization in its purest form, you look for the places where language has been engineered to stop memory from forming. You look for terms that describe control without explaining why control exists. You look for records that treat the space as a maintenance condition rather than a historical question. You look for the moment when the documentation stops saying changed and starts saying standard. That moment is 1947, because after 1947, the disappearance is no longer an active project. It is an inherited workflow. A space becomes restricted, and the label is accepted because it makes daily life easier. A door is kept locked, and no one challenges it because unlocking it creates problems. A key is issued and returned, and the ritual repeats until the ritual itself becomes the explanation. The final image of this normalization is almost painfully ordinary. A facility's key ring in a drawer, used so often the brass has dulled, with a small stamped tag that reads, "Maint restricted," and nothing else. No origin story, no note of what used to be there. Just a label, a lock, and a procedure that has survived long enough to feel like it was always supposed to. In 2024, Ochre Court still presents itself the way. Newport has always preferred its icons to be presented intact, authoritative, complete. The public narrative is smooth. Tours and institutional descriptions emphasize the scale, the artistry, the Gilded Age confidence. Visitors are guided through rooms designed to be seen, spaces that perform well in photographs and in memory. Even the language is curated to preserve that effect. Hunt's grandeur, the Goelet's status, the mansion as a finished statement. The story works because it feels settled. But the present has one advantage the 1890s did not. It can compare. It can overlay versions. It can move between catalogs, digitized collections, maintenance references, and the physical building in the same afternoon. That is where the official narrative begins to lose its monopoly. Not because a single dramatic document appears, but because the gaps line up too well across formats to be dismissed as coincidence. The modern point of entry is often banal: a digital catalog search, and new institutional archive index, a reference in a property description that leads to a scanned plan sheet, a maintenance notation in a facility's record that uses the same neutral vocabulary we've already traced. Restricted, service, preservation. None of these sources declares a secret. They do not need to. The present does not rely on confession. It relies on inconsistency that survives replication. The first confrontation happens when you compare what the tours show to what the building must contain. Ochre Court sits where it sits, and the cliff walk remains what it has always been, a line of public vantage beside private stone. The exterior reads as cohesive, yet on the cliffward side, the masonry still carries a small resistance to coherence, a seam that does not follow the rhythm of the original courses, a surface that is slightly too uniform in an area that should age differently, a wall section that looks finished in a way that feels more corrective than organic. In an older building, that might mean nothing. In a building whose story insists on completeness, it means something else. It means the stone and the narrative are not perfectly aligned. In 2025, that alignment can be tested with ordinary tools. Measurements taken from public vantage points can be compared to interior room dimensions. A corridor on paper, even a cleaned one, implies thickness and voids that a physical building must respect. Steps can be counted. Distances from one fixed architectural anchor to another can be paced repeatedly until they stop behaving like guesswork. What emerges is not a hidden chamber fantasy, it is a practical discrepancy. A small volume of space that exists structurally, but is not explained functionally. A dead thickness where there should be either a clear wall or a documented service feature. A place where the building is heavier than the story allows it to be. The next confrontation is with language. Modern institutional narratives tend to inherit earlier euphemisms because euphemisms are efficient. A tour script does not want to pause on a question it cannot answer without inviting more questions, so it doesn't. A facilities note does not want to explain the origin of every restricted area, so it reduces. Restricted is the institutional heir to storage. It is not a lie, it is a refusal to elaborate. In the present, that refusal becomes visible when you try to reconcile labels across time. A digitized plan sheet might show the basement or Service level is tidy and uncontroversial. A later institutional map might omit detail for safety reasons. A maintenance log might refer to a door or section by a tag rather than a name. And a tour narrative might never acknowledge the area at all. Each choice is defensible on its own. Together they create a pattern. The more consequential the threshold is, the more neutral the language becomes. That pattern is not resolved by a single breakthrough. It is proved by repetition. The same kind of neutral phrasing appears in multiple places that should not share an author: a facilities binder note, a maintenance work order, a preservation reference, a key control list. The words are slightly different, but the purpose is the same. They minimize specificity in exactly the area where specificity would create a traceable history. That is how a public story wins, not by defeating evidence, but by exhausting the reader's ability to insist on detail. The present also changes how photographs behave. In the 1890s, images were scarce and curated. In the institutional era, images multiply, but they still avoid certain angles because institutions photograph what they promote. In 2024 and 2025, a researcher can pull images from multiple categories: glossy promotional shots, historical archive photographs, student publications, event coverage, exterior views from the cliff walk. The overlaps are revealing. The mansion is photographed endlessly, yet the cliffward service boundary is photographed strangely little, especially in ways that would unintentionally capture the precise wall section and lower-level interfaces where a former access would have mattered. When an angle does appear, it is often wide enough to be flattering and vague. Beautiful stone, long lines, no detail. That absence would be meaningless if the paperwork were robust. But the paperwork, as we have seen, is precisely where earlier removal and later normalization did their work. In the present, the archive looks complete until you ask it a narrow question. Where is this described? Where is this labeled? Where is this explained? The public archive answers with grandeur. The operational archive answers with neutral terms, and the intersection, where history should live, answers with friction. The confrontation becomes most concrete when physical access is requested and denied without drama. A staff member may not refuse outright. They may simply delay. Not today. Safety. We don't take visitors there. Facilities would need to accompany. Each phrase is reasonable. Each phrase is also a mechanism that keeps the blind spot intact. In the present, the most effective barrier is not a locked door. It is a calendar and a policy. And still, the physical building continues to offer small confirmations that do not rely on institutional cooperation. A locked service door that sits where the public plan suggests nothing consequential should be. A hinge grade that feels heavier than a toe. Simple storage closet requires a key tag in a facility's context labeled with language that is careful not to be descriptive. A maintenance note that references restricted access for an inspection that should not require such emphasis unless the area is known to be sensitive. None of these prove motive. They prove management. This is where the present produces the documentary consequence your investigation has been building toward. The public story has been edited, not necessarily in content, but in a mission. The mansion is described as an icon, and icons survive by simplifying. The icon narrative does not need to explain every service correction, every rekeying, every legacy closure. But the moment you compare what exists to what is told, the simplification becomes a detectable edit, an intentional trimming of specificity around a functional feature that once required control. What changes in 2024 and 2025 is that the edit can be demonstrated without accusing anyone of scandal. You can show that the terminology drifted over time toward neutrality. You can show that the photographic record is abundant but selectively vague in the same spatial zone. You can show that measurements and plan coherence leave a small unaccounted volume, enough to matter, not enough to become mythology. You can show that operational records treat the area as routine restriction without origin story, which is exactly what normalization produces. And you can show that the institution, by default, has no incentive to clarify because clarifying creates administrative cost. That is the presence form of proof. Not revelation, verification by comparison. The story does not collapse because of this. Ochre Court remains magnificent. Its public narrative remains usable. But the investigation changes what intact can honestly mean. Intact does not mean unedited. Preserved does not mean fully explained. A building can be preserved as a symbol while leaving a blind spot unspoken, especially if, speaking it produces nothing the institution wants. No fundraising benefit, no educational necessity, no safety improvement, only questions. And that becomes the final tension as you approach the closing of the film. In 1896, the risk was scandal. In 1947, the risk was operational complexity. In 2024 and 2025, the risk is interpretive. Once people realize the public story has been smoothed, they begin to ask what else was smoothed with it. Because this is what preservation often protects. Quietly and effectively. Not only stone, but narrative stability. Institutions preserve what can be framed as heritage. They avoid naming what creates administrative friction. The most efficient erasure is still the one that looks like procedure, and procedure ages into tradition faster than anyone admits. The last image is contemporary and plain. A door in a lower service corridor, paint worn at the handle, a modern padlock or controlled latch fitted to older hardware, and a small laminated tag that reads, "Maint, restricted." No date, no explanation, just a label strong enough to survive staff turnover. Next to it, in a digital scan viewed on a screen, a basement plan that offers only neutral geometry, where the building insists on a story. Between the door and the diagram is the distance your investigation has traced, between what exists and what is said. And that is the question you end on, not as accusation, but as a sober test of legacy. What does an institution preserve in full? Light, and what does it prefer never to name? By 1892, Ochre Court rose on Newport's shoreline as an announcement, stone, scale, and certainty, shaped under the hand of Richard Morris Hunt, and financed to endure the gaze of an entire season. By 1947, the same structure crossed into institutional life, where locks, labels, and restricted corridors became policy rather than preference. And here, in 2025, the mansion remains publicly intact, yet the blind spot persists, precisely because it was engineered to persist. What this investigation has shown is not a melodrama, but a mechanism, a surviving note in the record, a discrepancy that still lives in the masonry, and a sequence of absences where clarity should have thickened, each one modest on its own and unmistakable in combination. The proof is not that a scandal occurred, but that the house was treated as something more than architecture. It was treated as a version, one to be stabilized, circulated, and defended. In the Gilded Age, power was rarely loud. It was procedural. It moved through quiet meetings, revised plan sheets, rekeyed doors, and vocabulary chosen to reduce interpretation. A wall can be built in a day. A narrative can be built in a generation. And once a narrative is made official, the most efficient form of erasure is to make every alternative sound like error. Ochre Court teaches that status was never only display. It was control of access, who could enter, who could be seen, who could claim knowledge. It was control of documentation, what survived as final, what was demoted into draft. And most enduringly, it was control of memory. Because memory is the only archive that can't be stamped, indexed, or quietly retired. Even now, the truth remains almost reachable. A locked service threshold, a neutral label, a file that explains everything by explaining nothing. Not a secret preserved by drama, but by social efficiency, by the simple fact that reopening old questions creates costs. And costs are what institutions are trained to avoid. So the door remains closed. The record remains smooth. The icon remains unchallenged, until someone compares what exists with what was allowed to be told. If you found this inquiry compelling, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And consider joining us. so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Which administrative explanation feels most plausible? Privacy, logistics, neighborhood pressure, or reputation? Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.